Sheriff Daniel Barnes had always prided himself on his ability to maintain order. For 15 years, he had served as the top law enforcement officer in Sweetwater County, Texas. The morning everything changed like any other. The summer heat was already building, promising another scorching Texas day. Daniel had woken early, brewing coffee in the kitchen as the sun rose, casting long shadows across their backyard. He had an early meeting at the station and needed his spare key to the evidence room, a key he rarely used but always kept in his dresser drawer for emergencies. The search for that key would unravel everything Daniel believed about his life, his marriage, and the future he had carefully constructed. No one who knew Sheriff Daniel Barnes would have predicted what happened next. No one could have foreseen the darkness that lurked beneath the surface of the man, tasked with keeping their community safe. And no one, least of all Daniel himself, could have anticipated the consequences of the choice he made in the heat of the moment. A choice that would transform him from the enforcer of law to its breaker in the span of a single, terrible day. "Damn it," he said, shutting the drawer with more force than necessary. The alarm clock on the nightstand read 6:17 a.m. He had less than 45 minutes before his meeting with the county prosecutor about a drug case that had been building for months. Without that spare key to the evidence room, he'd have to wait for Deputy Howard to arrive, which would make him late. Daniel glanced at the bed where Deborah still slept, her back to him, dark curls spread across the pillow. She'd come home late last night from a school counselors' conference in Austin. At least, that's what she'd told him. He'd been half asleep when she slipped into bed, too tired to do more than mumble a greeting. "Where'd I put that damn key?" he whispered, mentally retracing his steps. He'd had it last month when they'd booked Franklin Reed on possession charges. After logging the evidence, he'd brought the key home and... the spare set. Of course, he sometimes kept extra keys in the decorative wooden box on Deborah's side of the closet, a place for miscellaneous items they didn't use often but might need someday. Daniel crossed the room quietly, careful not to wake his wife. Their walk-in closet was divided neatly down the middle, his uniforms and casual clothes on one side, Deborah's colorful wardrobe on the other. The wooden box sat on the top shelf above her hanging dresses. Standing on tiptoe, Daniel reached for the box, his fingers just brushing its edge. He pushed a few of Deborah's shoeboxes aside to make room, and one toppled over, spilling its contents. With a sigh, he bent to collect the scattered items, a pair of leather gloves, some old greeting cards, and an envelope of photographs, when his eye caught something else, partially hidden beneath a folded sweater on the lower shelf. At first, his brain didn't process what he was seeing. A small, crumpled plastic wrapper. He reached for it automatically, thinking it was trash that needed disposing of, but as his fingers closed around it, recognition dawned. It was a condom wrapper, torn open and discarded. And beside it, wrapped in a tissue, was something that made his blood run cold. A used condom. Daniel stared at the evidence in his hand, his mind racing to find a reasonable explanation. They didn't use condoms. Deborah had had a hysterectomy 3 years ago after a cancer scare. There was no reason for this to be here. No innocent reason, anyway. "Daniel? What are you doing?" He turned to find Deborah standing in the closet doorway, her eyes widening as she registered what he was holding. She was wearing the silk nightgown he'd given her for their anniversary, her hand clutching the doorframe so tightly her knuckles whitened. "I think you need to explain this," Daniel said, his voice unnaturally calm despite the storm building inside him. He held up the condom, watching her face for any sign of denial or remorse. Deborah's voice faltered, and she took a step backward. "It's not what you think." "What exactly do you think I'm thinking, Deb?" Daniel asked, stepping closer, the evidence still dangling from his fingers. "Because right now, I'm thinking there's only one reason why this would be in our closet." Deborah's eyes darted around the room, as if searching for an escape route. "Can we talk about this later?" "You're going to be late for work." "Work can wait," Daniel said, tossing the condom and wrapper onto the bed. "This can't." Deborah crossed her arms over her chest, her initial shock hardening into something more defiant. "It's not yours, obviously." "Obviously," Daniel repeated, the word tasting bitter on his tongue. "So, whose is it, Deb? Who have you been bringing into our home? Into our bed?" It wasn't in our bed, she said quickly, then pressed her lips together, realizing her mistake. Daniel felt as if he'd been punched in the gut. The confirmation was worse than the suspicion. So, you're not even denying it? You're sleeping with someone else? It's complicated. Uncomplicated for me, Daniel said, his voice dropping dangerously low. I think I deserve that much. Deborah moved past him to sit on the edge of the bed, careful to avoid the evidence of her infidelity that lay on the comforter. She looked suddenly older in the harsh morning light, the fine lines around her eyes more pronounced. It just happened, Daniel. It wasn't planned. Who is he? When Deborah didn't immediately answer, Daniel raised his voice. Who is? He? It doesn't matter, she said, shaking her head. It's over. The hell it doesn't matter. I'm standing here holding proof that my wife is cheating on me, and you're telling me it doesn't matter who it is with? Daniel's control was slipping, the calm facade cracking to reveal the rage beneath. Is it someone I know? Someone from work? One of your colleagues? Deborah's silence was damning. Daniel felt a cold realization creep over him. It is someone I know, isn't it? He studied her face, noting the way she wouldn't meet his gaze. Is it Charles? Charles Winston from next door? The slight widening of Deborah's eyes told him everything he needed to know. Charles Winston, their neighbor for the past 4 years. A former college professor who now worked from home as a consultant. Single, charming, and apparently sleeping with Daniel's wife. How long? Daniel asked, his voice barely above a whisper. Daniel, how long have you been sleeping with him, Deborah? Weeks? Months? Our entire marriage? 6 months, she finally admitted. But it wasn't serious. It was just physical. Daniel laughed, a hollow sound devoid of humor. Just physical. Well, that makes it all better, doesn't it? I was going to end it, Deborah said, reaching for his hand, which he jerked away. I already told him it's over. That conference I went to yesterday. I didn't go. I spent the day with him, telling him we had to stop. That's why that's here. She gestured weakly toward the condom. It was the last time. So, you ended your affair and decided to bring a souvenir home? Hide it in our closet as a keepsake? Daniel shook his head in disbelief. Do you think I'm stupid, Deb? No, of course not. It was careless. I meant to dispose of it properly, but I was emotional and forgot. I never thought you'd find it. No, you just thought you'd get away with it, like you have been for the past 6 months. Daniel paced the room, the reality of the situation sinking in with each step. 6 months, Deb. Half a year you've been lying to my face, sneaking around with him. What else have you lied about? Nothing. Daniel, please. Deborah stood, reaching for him again. It was a mistake, a terrible mistake. But it's over now, and I want to make things right. We can work through this. Daniel stopped pacing and looked at his wife. Really looked at her. The woman he'd loved for 12 years. The woman he'd trusted with everything. The woman who had betrayed him in the most intimate way possible. Did you ever love me? He asked, his voice cracking slightly. Or was I just a convenient cover? The respectable sheriff husband who worked long hours and didn't ask too many questions? Of course I loved you. I love you still, Deborah insisted, tears forming in her eyes. This had nothing to do with how I feel about you. It was about me, my own weakness. Charles was there when I was feeling lonely, when you were working late nights and weekends on that last big case. So it's my fault? Daniel's voice rose again. I was doing my job, protecting this community, and that's your excuse for spreading your legs for the neighbor? That's not what I meant, Deborah said, flinching at his crude language. I'm just trying to explain what happened. What happened is, you cheated. You lied. You betrayed everything we built together. Daniel's hand went instinctively to his hip, where his service weapon would normally be holstered, but he was still in his undershirt and pajama bottoms. His gun was locked in the safe by the front door, as it was every night when he came home. Deborah noticed the gesture and took a step back, her eyes widening with fear. Daniel, you're scaring me. I'm scaring you? Daniel laughed again, that same humorless sound. Good. Because I'm scaring myself right now, with the thoughts going through my head. What are you going to do? Deborah asked, her voice small. Daniel looked at his watch. 6:42 a.m. The meeting he'd been so concerned about minutes ago now seemed trivial, distant. What did evidence for a drug case matter when his own life was imploding? I'm going to get dressed, he said finally, and then I'm going to have a talk with Charles Winston. No, Daniel, please. Deborah moved to block the closet door. Leave him out of this. This is between us. He made it his business when he slept with my wife, Daniel said, gently but firmly moving her aside. Now, I'm going to make it mine. Daniel, don't do anything stupid, Deborah pleaded, grabbing his arm. You're the sheriff. Think about what you're risking. For a moment, Daniel considered her words. His position, his reputation, the life he'd built in Sweetwater County, all of it could be jeopardized by what he did next. But another part of him, a darker part he rarely acknowledged, didn't care about the consequences. That part only wanted one thing, to make Charles Winston pay for touching what was his. I'll be back, Daniel said, pulling away from Deborah's grasp. Don't call him, don't warn him. If you do, Deb, I swear to God, you'll regret it. As he pulled his uniform from the closet, Daniel could hear Deborah crying behind him. Once, the sound would have broken his heart, made him drop everything to comfort her. Now, it only fueled the cold anger spreading through his veins. Charles Winston lived in the duplex next door, a man Daniel had shared beers with on warm summer evenings, a man who had sat at their dinner table and laughed at Daniel's jokes, a man who had been sleeping with Daniel's wife while Daniel worked late nights keeping the county safe. The irony wasn't lost on him. Sheriff Daniel Barnes had spent his career upholding the law, ensuring justice was served. But as he buttoned his uniform shirt and secured his badge, justice was the furthest thing from his mind. What he wanted now wasn't justice. It was vengeance. Charles Winston's duplex sat just 50 yards from Daniel and Deborah's home, separated by a stretch of well-maintained lawn and a decorative rock garden Deborah had installed 2 summers ago. Daniel had helped Charles move in 4 years earlier, carrying heavy boxes of books up the narrow staircase while Charles directed where each should go. They had become friends of convenience, neighbors who shared occasional meals and conversations, but never delved too deeply into each other's lives. Now, as Daniel strode across the lawn, each step bringing him closer to confrontation, he wondered how much of their friendship had been real, and how much had been a cover for Charles's betrayal. Had Charles laughed behind his back each time they shared a beer on Daniel's porch? Had he been sleeping with Deborah even then? Daniel's uniform felt strange against his skin, as if he was wearing a costume rather than the badge he'd earned through years of service. His service weapon, a Glock 22, hung heavy on his hip, a weight he normally found reassuring but now felt ominous. The morning was warming rapidly, the Texas sun already beginning to assert its dominance over the day. A few early risers in the neighborhood were collecting newspapers from their driveways or watering plants before the heat became unbearable. Mrs. Jackson from across the street waved cheerfully as she walked her Yorkshire Terrier. But Daniel barely acknowledged her, his focus entirely on the green door of Charles's duplex. He hesitated for just a moment before knocking, a brief instant where reason tried to prevail over emotion. What was his plan here? To confront Charles, certainly. But then what? Arrest him? Fight him? The law provided no recourse for adultery these days. Charles had broken no statute that Daniel could enforce as sheriff. The moment passed, and Daniel rapped sharply on the door, 3 hard knocks that seemed to echo in the quiet morning air. He waited, his heart pounding in his chest, adrenaline coursing through his veins. No answer. Daniel knocked again, louder this time, his patience already wearing thin. "Winston, open up! It's Sheriff Barnes." He heard movement inside, a thump, the rustle of fabric, footsteps approaching the door. Then silence, as if whoever was inside had paused, perhaps looking through the peephole to confirm their visitor's identity. "I know you're in there, Charles," Daniel called, his voice carrying the authority of his position. "Open the door." The lock clicked, and the door opened a few inches, restricted by a security chain. Charles Winston's face appeared in the gap, sleep-tousled and wary. "Daniel? What's going on? It's not even 7 in the morning." "We need to talk," Daniel said flatly. "Open the door." Charles's eyes flicked to Daniel's uniform, noting the badge and gun. Is this official business? Because if not, can it wait until a reasonable hour? Open the door, Daniel repeated, his voice dropping to a dangerous register. Or I'll open it for you. Something in Daniel's tone must have conveyed the gravity of the situation, because Charles closed the door briefly to remove the chain, then opened it fully. He was wearing only a pair of pajama bottoms, his lean upper body bare, showing the physique of a man 20 years his junior, despite being roughly Daniel's age. The sight only fueled Daniel's anger. This was the body that had been pressed against his wife, that had given her pleasure while Daniel worked late nights protecting the community. Come in, Charles said, stepping back to allow Daniel entry. What's this about? Daniel stepped inside, noting the sparse, tasteful furnishings of Charles's living room. Bookshelves lined one wall, filled with academic texts and literature. A laptop sat open on a sleek desk by the window, papers neatly stacked beside it. Everything in its place, controlled and orderly, just like Charles himself. You know exactly what this is about, Daniel said, closing the door behind him. You and Deborah. Charles's expression changed almost imperceptibly. A slight widening of the eyes, a tightening of the jaw, but he quickly regained his composure. I don't know what you're talking about. Don't lie to me. Daniel took a step closer, invading Charles's personal space. I found the evidence this morning, in my closet, a little souvenir from your last rendezvous. Understanding dawned on Charles's face, followed by resignation. He sighed deeply, running a hand through his short hair. She told you, then? No, she didn't tell me, Daniel said, his voice rising. I found a used condom hidden in my wife's wardrobe. She only confessed when I confronted her with the evidence. Some honesty, that is. Charles moved to the couch and sat down heavily, as if the weight of the revelation had physically affected him. I'm sorry, Daniel. Truly, I am. It wasn't supposed to happen. That's what she said too. It just happened. Like you both tripped and fell into an affair. Daniel remained standing, looking down at the man who had betrayed him. 6 months, Charles. 6 months you've been sleeping with my wife. Coming to our house for dinner, sharing drinks on my porch, all while you were screwing Deborah behind my back. It wasn't like that, Charles said, leaning forward, his elbows on his knees. It wasn't just physical. He never finished the sentence. Daniel's fist connected with his jaw, sending him sprawling back against the couch cushions. The pain that shot through Daniel's knuckles was satisfying in a primal way. A physical manifestation of the emotional agony he'd been experiencing since discovering the condom. Charles touched his jaw gingerly, a trickle of blood appearing at the corner of his mouth. I suppose I deserved that. You deserve a hell of a lot more than that, Daniel said, shaking out his hand. You talk about real feelings and connecting like that justifies what you did. Like betraying me, betraying our friendship, is somehow noble because you think you love her. I do love her, Charles said quietly, his eyes meeting Daniel's. And I think she loves me too, even if she won't admit it to you or herself. The words hit Daniel like a physical blow, more painful than any punch Charles could have thrown. The possibility that Deborah truly loved this man, that their affair had been more than a physical indiscretion, was almost too much to bear. You don't know what love is, Daniel said, his voice shaking with emotion. Love is standing by someone for 12 years, through cancer scares and family deaths, and all the small daily struggles. Love is sacrifice and commitment, not sneaking around behind someone's back. And where were you during those struggles, Daniel? Charles asked, rising from the couch to stand eye to eye with the sheriff. How many nights did Deborah spend alone while you worked late? How many times did she need you, only to find you unavailable, consumed by your job? Don't you dare try to justify this, Daniel warned, his hand moving unconsciously toward his weapon. Don't you dare make it sound like I drove her into your arms. I'm not justifying anything, Charles said, noticing the movement and taking a cautious step back. What we did was wrong. The lying, the sneaking around, it was all wrong. But the feelings are real, Daniel. And maybe instead of threatening me, you should be asking yourself why your wife sought comfort elsewhere. It was the wrong thing to say. Something snapped inside Daniel, a release of the tenuous control he'd maintained since discovering the condom. With a roar of fury, he lunged at Charles, tackling him to the ground. They crashed into the coffee table, sending books and a glass tumbler flying. The glass shattered against the hardwood floor as the two men grappled, Daniel's training giving him an immediate advantage. He straddled Charles, pinning him down with his weight, and landed another punch, this one catching Charles in the eye, and another to the ribs, feeling something give beneath his fist. Charles tried to defend himself, raising his arms to block the blows, but Daniel was relentless, fueled by a rage he had never experienced before. "Daniel, stop!" Charles gasped between punches. "This won't solve anything." But Daniel was beyond reason. Each punch was a release, a cathartic expulsion of the pain and betrayal he felt. In that moment, he wasn't Sheriff Daniel Barnes, upholder of the law. He was simply a man whose world had been shattered, striking out at the one who had helped destroy it. It wasn't until he felt the warm wetness of blood on his knuckles that reality began to reassert itself. Charles's face was a mess of blood and swelling, his left eye already beginning to close from the force of Daniel's blows. He had stopped struggling, his arms fallen limply to his sides. Daniel paused, breathing heavily, the red haze of anger slowly receding. What was he doing? This wasn't justice. It was assault. As a law enforcement officer, he was committing a crime, the very thing he had sworn to prevent. He climbed off Charles, staggering backward until his back hit the bookshelf. Books tumbled from the shelves, adding to the chaos of the room. Charles rolled onto his side, coughing and spitting blood onto the pristine hardwood floor. "Is this who you are, Daniel?" Charles asked, his voice raspy and weak. "Is this the man Deborah married? No wonder she—" "Shut up," Daniel said, the deadly calm in his voice a stark contrast to the violence of moments before. "Just shut up." "Or what? You'll kill me?" Charles struggled to a sitting position, wincing in pain. "Go ahead. Show Deborah exactly the kind of man you really are. Show her why she was right to leave you." "She hasn't left me," Daniel said, but even to his own ears, the words sounded hollow. "Not yet," Charles agreed, wiping blood from his mouth with the back of his hand. "But she will. You've made sure of that today." Something about Charles's certainty, the smug assurance in his tone despite his battered state, pushed Daniel over the edge again. Without conscious thought, his hand moved to his holster, drawing his service weapon in one smooth motion practiced countless times at the firing range. Charles's eyes widened as he found himself staring down the barrel of Daniel's Glock. "Daniel, think about what you're doing," he said, raising his hands slowly. "You're a sheriff. This isn't you." "You don't know who I am," Daniel said, the gun steady in his hand despite the turmoil inside him. "You think because you fucked my wife. You know me? You don't know anything." "I know you're not a murderer," Charles said, his voice surprisingly calm for a man facing a loaded weapon. "I know that whatever has happened between Deborah and me, whatever you're feeling right now, it's not worth throwing your life away." Daniel's finger hovered near the trigger, not on it, his training still ingrained deeply enough to prevent that fatal mistake, but close. So close. One small movement, and Charles Winston would no longer exist, would no longer be a threat to his marriage, his happiness, his sense of self. Time seemed to stretch and contract simultaneously. Daniel was aware of everything around him with hyper-real clarity. The morning light streaming through the window, illuminating dust motes in the air, the tick of a clock somewhere in the apartment, the rasp of Charles's breathing, the weight of the gun in his hand. "She won't forgive you for this," Charles said softly, breaking the silence. "Even if you walk out that door right now, even if you holster that gun and never speak of this again, she won't forgive what you've already done. And if you pull that trigger, you'll lose her forever. Is that what you want, Daniel? To lose everything because of me?" The question penetrated the fog of rage surrounding Daniel's thoughts. What did he want? Revenge, certainly. Justice, in some primitive eye-for-an-eye sense. But beyond that immediate satisfaction, what was the endgame here? Could he really shoot an unarmed man, a neighbor, in cold blood, and live with himself afterward? Could his marriage survive not just the affair, but the violent aftermath? Daniel pulled the trigger, targeting in between his legs. A pool of blood was seen gouging. "Help me! Don't let me die," Charles said. "You should have thought about that before you started sleeping with my wife," Daniel cut him off. "This is me being merciful, Charles. Don't mistake it for weakness." Daniel headed out of the apartment and went back to his house, but the neighbors already heard the gunshot, and they called 911. Minutes later, police arrived at the scene. With a heavy sigh, Daniel put the car in drive and pulled away from the curb, leaving behind the home he had shared with Deborah for the past decade. He had no destination in mind, only the need to be elsewhere. Anywhere but there, with his wife's betrayal pressing in on him from all sides. As he drove, his mind replayed the events of the morning on an endless loop. Finding the condom, confronting Deborah, the fight with Charles, the moment he had stood in that bathroom with his gun drawn, the shooting. What kind of man had he become in the span of a few hours? Not the man he had believed himself to be, not the upstanding sheriff who prided himself on his integrity and commitment to justice. This morning, he had crossed lines he had never imagined crossing, broken laws he had sworn to uphold. And for what? A marriage that might already be beyond saving? Daniel's phone rang again. He glanced at it, seeing Deborah's name on the screen. He let it go to voicemail. Whatever she had to say, he wasn't ready to hear it. Not yet. He was ready to face the consequences of his action. He kept on driving endlessly, hoping to meet his end if needs be.